Israel is going to attack Iran, and it's going to be painful, it's lethal, and it's going to be soon. That, according to Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant, who repeated that earlier today. And really, the whole world is sitting wondering when all of this is going to happen, what's going to happen. You have the U.S. has just sent a theater high altitude air defense system along with 100 boots on the ground, and all of the ramifications that could have for this war, which is already expanding, potentially blowing into something even bigger. And we have a rare guest for us today on this topic, one we haven't had before, and I'm very excited to have Sulaiman Ahmed, who is a journalist and a geopolitical expert, often on X. And if you guys have ever watched, I'm sure you probably have. Most of our folks follow you on your show, and as well as Mario Nafal, and had the pleasure of being on with you a few times. Welcome to the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a privilege to be joining you, Daniel, on the show.
Well, we're grateful to have you on there. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because I just really like how you conduct your shows. And one of the things, and for those who may not know, is some of your X Spaces or Mario's X Spaces. One of the reasons I think they're so valuable and why I really like to listen to them is because you have different perspectives come on. It's not like an echo chamber of any kind. And quite often you have some of the guests that you involve actually getting after it on each other. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the genesis of that and why you use that format.
Yeah, I mean, initially, the aim of those spaces were to have an open dialogue or open platform where people can debate and discuss. Obviously, certain topics become a lot more heated than other topics. And I would say the Israel-Palestine or the Israel-Lebanon now is extremely heated. And there is a mass campaigns, generally speaking, for censorship from the Israeli side. But I think it's always a good conduit to have that both perspectives on that. And then the audience can decide the veracity of basically both claims as opposed to basically being in an echo chamber. A lot of times what happens is when you focus in on one aspect, let's say you focus on the military aspect, maybe you'll have too much pro-Israeli perspectives. And that's why it's always an honor and a privilege to have you on, because you do balance that out.
Well, yeah, and it's really good because that's one of the problems we have on the Western media, and I'm going to show you some examples of it that on this show here. Is that you only have one view of it, and it's almost always on a pro-Israeli side, and that the Palestinians either aren't valid, they are not worthy of any kind of consideration, and that certainly goes for the Lebanese or the Iranians, really anyone over there. And I find that to be really, really problematic, just on a humanitarian level, as a human being, but even if you just want to take the morality out of it from a national security perspective, because not demonizing, but minimizing the other person like they're not really there leads to bad choices, which are bad for everybody. And that's one of the things we want to talk about here. And I want to start off by looking at Yoav Gallant. I mentioned that he was reported on Israeli media today as emphasizing again that a strike is coming. Here's what he said on October the 9th, where he put a little bit more meat behind it.
You saw the strikes that Iran launched against us a short time ago. Those strikes were aggressive, but they failed because they weren't accurate. Just as we have been doing until now in the war on all other fronts, whoever attacks us will be hurt and will pay a price. Our attack will be deadly, precise, and above all, surprising. They will not understand what happened or how it happened. They will see the results.
Now, I remember, like, even the night of the Iranian response, when they sent those 180 plus missiles towards Israel, that Netanyahu went out and he made his brash comment that stuff is coming soon. The next morning, the Israeli UN ambassador Danon, also went on emphatically and said something's coming. And yet here we are on the 15th, and there still hasn't been one. What do you attribute that delay to?
It's a really good question. It's something that I've been trying to understand myself as well. One can only come to the presumption that the reason for it is I think time-wise, it didn't come at the right time, because you basically had October the 7th and October the 8th. And my thought at that time was that they didn't want to sully the memory of October the 7th or October the 8th, and hence why they didn't respond in that manner. But now we're up to October the 15th. It does seem to be that there is significant negotiations going on with the Israelis and the Americans in terms of the mode of response and the locations of response. The Israelis clearly want to go after oil facilities or possibly even nuclear facilities. On the other hand, the Americans don't want them to do that because of, first of all, the financial impact it will have on the economy. But in addition to that, they don't want major escalation in Iran. And I do believe that Israel doesn't want that right now as well. When they went into Gaza at that time, I actually thought that that was a prime time for Hezbollah to attack from the north of Israel, and they didn't do so. And my thought at that time was that once they've basically almost succeeded in Gaza, which they have in terms of the ethnic cleansing and genocide that's going on, but that they would turn around and go after Hezbollah. And then they've done that. And I think when it comes to Iran, again, they don't want to fight in 2 fronts or 3 fronts. So I do believe that their psychology is to do a minimal response now, enough to appease the public, in their minds to take on Hezbollah in Lebanon, possibly defeat them, and then after that they'll turn their eye to Iran. I think that's the process. They want to go one person at a time.
Well, yeah, from a military perspective, that would certainly make a lot more sense. Although I've been arguing that the bite they've already bitten off with you still having to fight after a year in Hamas in the Gaza Strip, now actually accelerating somewhat in the West Bank, even periodic shots to Yemen against the Houthis, and then this really full-on war opened up in Lebanon. That is an enormous military task, and I'm frankly not really clear how Israel is going to be able to win this. I mean, on any terms, all of these different fronts, each one of them has to have a military attainable objective so that you can get to some kind of an end. But it's getting hard for me to see it. And I wonder if you have any clarity, whether from your own observations or some of your other guests, on what the Israel end state is for all this.
It's a very good question, because I'm with you on this. I don't think that the Lebanese front is going to be as easy as they believe. I mean, you've got some commentators arguing that they could go as far as Beirut. Some argue up to the Awali River. And so when you've got such a broad, deep objective, which is to go that deep into Lebanon, it's not going to be very easy. It's going to be very difficult. And I agree with you. I don't think they're going to succeed in Lebanon. I was giving it more from the Israeli perspective. Now, in terms of what their end goal is in Gaza, they failed, right? Because they said that the end goal in Gaza was 2 objectives: get the hostages back, and the second was to dismantle Hamas. Well, they've clearly not dismantled Hamas, and they've not got their hostages back. And now, in terms of not getting their hostages back, they've now started a new front and almost ignored their hostages. Now, in Lebanon, what I think that they're going to do is they're going to continue to bomb Beirut. They're going to continue to inflict mass casualties and hope that the public turn on each other, or the Lebanese people turn on each other, or cause some form of civil war, which makes the situation a lot easier. And you see that from the propaganda narrative, you see that from the social media narrative, you see that from a lot of unknown botted accounts that are coming across, who are basically bot accounts that are basically perpetuating this idea of being anti-resistance, anti-Hezbollah, sometimes pro-Israel, sometimes not pro-Israel. And I think this is the psychology, to use a kind of like psychological warfare, and I hope that helps. But yeah, I agree with you. Logically, I just can't see an end goal, them getting to their end goal.
Now, one of the, especially on the folks that are opposed to Israel, say, well, look, this is just nothing but an attempt to get rid of all of the Palestinians out of both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank eventually. Do you see any? I'm torn, because on the one hand, I do see some actions that just don't seem to make any sense if you actually wanted to bring peace to the region, if you wanted to, quote, destroy the military wing of Hamas, but bring some kind of stability back to the civil population, because they have literally methodically just almost wiped out the ability for anyone to survive after this war is even over. And now we see going on in the north, it seems like there's on some sort of almost a starvation campaign. So one wonders, are they actually trying to get rid of all the people? And is that even possible? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do believe that that was their objective from the beginning, which was to ethnically cleanse Gaza as part of the genocide. And the reason for it is because they want that land to be one Israel. And as you said, you saw the complete destruction of Israel, not just in terms of human casualties, which according to even the Lancet report could be close to 200,000, But in addition to that, if you look at the severe destruction of the infrastructure, it would take decades to rebuild the Gaza. It would take even longer to bring it back to a point where it is even an active civilization. And so when you take that into consideration, what one can assume is that, yeah, the plan is to remove the populace from the land and then have external people help basically rebuild Gaza in the way that they want, where it doesn't be a location where initially Israelis will inhabit it, but later they may. So I think the entire psychology of what they attempt to do in Gaza is clear. You saw that now in terms of the north, where, as you said, there's a starvation process. There's a process where they want to annex it as well, according to certain reports. And they also, if you look at the language of the Israelis, they all are, a lot of them are basically speaking about taking control of Gaza. The difference is how long for, and they even make a distinction. They say, look, we don't want to take Lebanon. We don't want to take South of Lebanon, but with Gaza, the story is different. So you can see this kind of conversation happen where they're basically conditioning the public into this psychology. And then I do believe that they'll do the same thing to southern Lebanon as well there.
But where would they put the people? Because and let me ask you this from a different perspective, from the other regimes in the region, whether it's Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, Egypt, etc. They all have, especially the population throughout the Middle East, the Arab population is just infuriated by this. Even Erdogan in Turkey has continued to rail a lot. But is there a line, or is there not a line beyond which Israel could go if they physically start getting rid of people? And even if that was the desire, how would they do that? If Egypt doesn't open that gate and doesn't open people up, where can the people go?
I mean, I agree with you in terms of Egypt or Jordan. These countries obviously have a kind of complex situation because their populace is with the Palestinian people. And so any move that's seen as aiding and abetting Israel will be taken extremely negatively by that population. But there can be a scenario where, in my view, where people think, or the populace within Egypt or Jordan can believe or be made to believe that what they're doing is help supporting the Palestinians by giving them land after they've been completely removed, genocided, or the entire infrastructure has been destroyed. And so from that perspective, they can condition their own populace to agree to some kind of allowance of the migration of the Palestinians. And then in addition to that, it's quite clear that the Egyptians and the Jordanians would be open to like financial benefits from the United States and possibly even Israel, even though it may not be directly from them, to basically take these people in. So I do think that is the long-term objective. I do think that is what they are planning, and I do believe that's what they're going to do. It's about just conditioning the populace to agree to doing it. And if you do it under the right circumstances, in terms of claiming you're helping, you could basically convince people that it was the right thing to do.
But could you convince the Palestinian people that it's the right thing to do? Because they have continued to resist ever since the Nakba in the 1948, that this is their land, that they were pushed off of it, and it's their historic land. So would they ever willingly leave it?
I think some would. Some would willingly leave it because of believing that they've got no choice, thinking about their children, thinking about their family. So there will be some who leave. Obviously, there'll be others who for sure will never give up their land. People throughout history, throughout millennia, have basically fought for the sovereignty of their land. So, of course, there will be some who don't. And I guess the question is going to become, what is the manner by which Israel deal with them? Some of them will obviously be imprisoned, but you can't imprison a huge populace like that as well. So, again, this is something we're going to have to see. I'm not sure exactly what they'll do. Obviously, the plan is to kill some of them. The plan is to imprison some of them. The plan is to remove them from the land, some of them. And then those who don't fit into any of those categories, it's going to be interesting to see what they do.
Now, the Gaza Strip is one thing, because that's been almost methodically just turned into rubble already, and all you can do is bring bulldozers in to get rid of that stuff and whatever, get it off to who knows where. The West Bank, though, is a much bigger issue because it is literally intertwined within Israel and Israeli Arabs, etc. And it's got, I think the number is like, 5 million, I think, Palestinians are residents in that area. So that's going to be a lot more difficult to solve. And it's hard for me to see how you could get rid of the Palestinians in Gaza and not take care of the people that are in the West Bank. How do you see that playing out?
It's a really good question. And what we do know is there is no plans for a two-state solution. That's quite clear, both in terms of the actions of the Israeli government and the words of the Israeli government. They've clearly stated that they don't agree, but they don't want a two-state solution or a one-state solution. So in terms of there being an actual, real Palestinian state, I don't believe that's going to happen. So when we've taken that into consideration, then you got a scenario where what's going to happen in the West Bank. I believe that with the West Bank, they're probably going to do things in a different manner to what they've done in South Lebanon and what they've done in Gaza, which is to do it a lot more slowly. So slowly, I mean, if they've been occupying the land slowly over time, they'll accelerate that process. They'll try and remove as many Palestinians as possible. Do I think that they're going to take an invading force into West Bank as they did per Gaza and South Lebanon? I do believe that that will be the plan, but I don't think that's the immediate goal. I think the immediate goal is South Lebanon. I don't think they'll succeed in that. But hypothetically speaking, if they did succeed in that, then I think the next plan is Iran. And then if they were to succeed in that, then possibly they'd look at the West Bank.
Yeah, it's really mind-boggling to even think that those conversations can be had of the type that we're having right now. A year ago, if anyone had even given voice to such a plan right now, it would have been met with outrage, and of course not. And it's also ironic, if not perverse, that the United States has almost in the last century prided itself on defending the weak and standing up for anybody that was the subject of genocide or ethnic cleansing. I mean, we've even used military force to prevent it. And now we could, you said it a second ago, it just did not miss me. We could end up actually paying for this relocation to go elsewhere, which would help Israel complete this process that we otherwise go to war to prevent. And one of the ways that is even those words can even come out of a mouth is because we have systematically, I think, dehumanized the Palestinian population. And I'm going to show you this excerpt here from a couple of people. You're going to see Lindsey Graham talking on the one hand, and then you're going to see a response by a Palestinian ambassador. Watch this exchange.
A de-radicalized, a demilitarized Palestinian enclave is what Israel wants. They've been radicalized. They're the most radicalized population on the planet. From the time you're born in Gaza to the time you die, you're taught to hate the Jews.
You heard what Senator Graham there especially had to say. Do you think that was a realistic scenario that he outlined, or pie in the sky stuff?
I wish you didn't force me to have to hear this nonsense that actually explains why the U.S. for the last 3 decades has failed miserably to play the role of an honest mediator. Why the U.S. has failed to be the grown-up in the room, it's because of the logic expressed by Senator Graham, Lindsey Graham just now. And I was the ambassador to Washington, and I did meet Senator Graham many times, and I tried to actually persuade him that this mindset, this complete adoption of the Israeli narrative does not help the cause of peace.
And you know what? I just wonder how you can say the stuff that Graham did there, like those darn Palestinians, they're filled with hate, without looking at what's been done to them. I mean, how does that dichotomy strike you?
Well, it's interesting because, first of all, it's an inaccurate statement, because what they're doing is creating a psychology about an entire populace. And that's actually a mode that has been used throughout history. If you look at World War II, what was the mode by which you basically have the populace agree to the, basically in Nazi Germany, was the Holocaust of the Jewish people, was to dehumanize them, to make people believe that they weren't totally human. And you see that through the history books, that this has always been the psychology. Many people, many war veterans talk about this. You talk, even Prince Harry, I know they were in the United Kingdom. After he left the army, he wrote a book and he actually explained how the objective of the army was to teach you or to train your mind into thinking that your opponent wasn't really a human. So this is what they do. So because a person, when they think, if they see the opponent as a human, they'll start treating them, they'll humanize them, they'll treat them as humans, they'll have empathy, they won't be sociopathic. And so when they're given this psychology about someone in Gaza from the day they're born, being conditioned in that manner, you automatically think, wow, these people aren't the same as us. And then you're willing to agree to basically agree to whatever actions you do. And in this situation, when you're bombing them, that's the way you can get a populace to agree to it. But then let me be clear, like that hasn't worked, because the vast majority of people through the planet, even if it's the Western world, have seen these children being bombed, have been seeing these children get blown up, and they've just not accepted it. So even though they try to dehumanize, it doesn't completely work. But that is the mode by it. And you saw that recently, right? The headlines after the major massacre in Gaza, people were burnt alive. Men were burnt alive. Children were burnt alive. Babies were burnt alive. There were patients with IV in their hands who were burnt alive. And if you look at the reports in Fox News, in CNN, Sky News in the UK, BBC News, it was a very much propaganda-based news. So, for example, Sky News said, because at the same day, Hezbollah attacked the Israeli military base, Golani base, with missiles. There were 4 Israeli soldiers killed. And they said, the headline said, 4 Israeli teenagers killed, and 23 people in Gaza died. Whereas when you look at the shock and horror, it was actually 4 soldiers who died, military soldiers who died while in Golani base, and there were 23 civilians burnt alive. So that shows it. Or for example, in the BBC News, where they said it was 4 soldiers killed and 23 Palestinians died. So this again is the psychology that both of these British newspapers are presenting to dehumanize it and to minimize using certain languages and certain linguistic tools to minimize what the Israelis are doing and to maximize what's happening to them.
Now, I've noticed that you touched on this just a second ago. It's not working on everybody. It seems to be working on the corporate major media outlets, because that's I see that same dynamic playing out here in the United States as well. But you also see in the United States, like a lot of these college students are protesting. A lot of the younger generation, especially, are protesting and furious about all this, and they don't like it at all. But one of the things that puzzles me, though, and I wonder if you have any insight on this, is to forget the headline, but when you see on social media, all these images of children, having to have amputations with no anesthesia, or having kids lose their limbs at all, and certainly women and children being killed, that no matter what their ethnicity or anything else, that how can we see that and not be moved anymore? I mean, this may sound rhetorical, but I genuinely don't get it.
Well, I think what this has shown is the vast majority of people have been moved. The vast majority of people have souls, are humans, and they do see it from an empathetic perspective. And so that's why you're seeing, even in the Western world, millions upon millions of people marching. In the UK, we have millions. Our adult population is only around 30 to 40 million who are able to go to these protests. And yet on some weekends, we had 1.3 million people come to the protests. Millions upon millions of people have been impacted by it. And it's actually the imagery that has impacted them more than anything else, even though sometimes we try and give a rational basis, we'll give some political analysis, but it's actually the images, what people see, it's the videos that people see that impact even the educated class. So that's one aspect that has definitely happened. I mean, when you look at the situation, you talked about the college protesters. Again, the US media tried to basically turn that into a situation where they try to make it into a right versus left issue, so that people think, oh, these are the same old BLM, these are the same old Antifa people. And so even that narrative hasn't been working completely, even though I know in the US has probably worked slightly more than most other countries. But if you look at the at it, most people have been impacted by it. And actually, if you look at people who are pro-Israeli, generally it's Israeli themselves. It's either people who are Zionists themselves, or it's people who are getting financial benefit, either directly or indirectly. But generally speaking, the vast majority of people are vehemently against the genocide.
And what is it like in the Middle East, like in Saudi Arabia, or in the UAE, or in Jordan or Egypt, in terms of the general population? How is that playing out?
Oh, amongst the general population, they are vehemently with the Palestinian people, and they're significantly against the Israelis. Now, in terms of the Middle East, there's kind of a little bit more of a nuance and complexity to it when it comes to Iran. Obviously, there is this concern about Iran taking, a position in the Middle East, which can be a dominant position. So there are certain concerns among certain Middle Eastern countries in that regard. But when it comes to Palestine specifically, I mean, there is no kind of the vast majority, and I mean the overwhelming majority of people are significantly for Palestine and are against the genocide. It's one of the things that's kind of united the entire Middle East as well as the Western world.
And is there any dispute or differences of opinion on what to do about it within the Arab population? I.e., does some say, "Hey, Egypt, open your borders, let's get them out of there and take care of them," or do they say, "No, keep the borders closed, but put pressure on Israel to end the war"? How is that playing out?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question because I believe it was about 6 months ago, there were certain reports that claimed that Egypt was planning to open its borders and they'd created an enclave or a certain area where they were going to house these Palestinians. And the Egyptian people were vehemently angry about it. They rose up, they stood up, they spoke out against it. And that didn't happen. And even if that was fake news, which a lot of people are saying that that wasn't legitimate, what that demonstrated was that any kind of action by the government that the people think is facilitating the agenda of the Israelis in terms of the ethnic cleansing, that the people will speak out. And so even if that was fake news or it was the government testing the waters or some elite class testing the waters, the people spoke out against it and vehemently disagreed.
I see. That's really fascinating and illustrative of what may come next. And I want to shift gears just a little bit. Something we started talking about at the top. I told you it wasn't just the Western leaders, but obviously some Israelis have views that are rather detached from a comprehensive reality, or at least very skewed from their own perspective. But the issue that I want to look at right now is that this war could expand in lots of different ways, and there's like fires burning all over the place. Here was a commentator on Sky News that just kind of really laid out in a very concise form just what Israel has undertaken for itself.
The United States is now actively involved in another war in the Middle East. It has 2 aircraft carriers there. It's got a nuclear submarine there. It was already engaged in the defense of Israel the last time Iran sent missiles in that direction. Israel can't defend itself without the United States. Now we've got a THAAD missile system. There are 100 boots on the ground, and Israel is preparing to attack Iran again. It's doing this while it still hasn't finished the job in Gaza because Hamas has not been destroyed yet. The hostages aren't back. It's now starting a fight on the northern front with Hezbollah into Lebanon, and it means to settle a score with Iran and must be thinking about striking the Iranian nuclear facilities. So I think that this is a moment of great danger for the world, that this war could escalate well beyond a regional war into a much wider one.
Now, those are some of the ones we've talked about here. Do you see any evidence that this could expand something besides Israel, U.S., and Iran? Could any other states also be drawn into this if it gets wider?
Yeah, I do believe so. So, I mean, we've discussed it previously, right? That I do believe that the US is going to get involved. And obviously, we know they're already involved. But I think when it gets to a point where there's significant Israelis there be significant Israeli casualties, then I do believe that America is going to get involved. So then the question becomes, if America's involved with possible boots in the ground on the region, will Russia get involved? Well, we're starting to see certain reports already. We're starting to see certain governmental people, and I can't remember who I read now, but there was earlier today I read where they were basically saying Iran is the problem because Iran funds Hamas, Iran funds Hezbollah, and then the argument was Iran funds Russia. And so this connection they're trying to make between Iran and Russia, there were also reports that Iran possibly used Russian missiles in this recent attack, is an attempt to basically bring them both together. And so if that's the case, then there is a possibility that Russia gets drawn in. Now, with Russia, the difficulty is that they're already in a proxy war against Ukraine. And so it's not going to be easy for Russia to fight on 2 fronts. But if there is a way of the Russians supporting, then I do think the Russians will support. So, yeah, that would then escalate. I don't think China is going to get involved. So the Russian question is the real question, which brings forth the point that is there going to be significant escalation where a major country is going to get involved? And the main country you can see is Russia. Russia basically fought ISIS in Syria. If it wasn't for Russia, Syria likely would have fallen. If it wasn't for Russia, Bashar likely would have fallen. So I do believe that, yeah, there is a possibility of that happening.
And let's look at the Chinese part of it, because while they are very, very reticent to even think about military operations anywhere other than Taiwan, they also have a significant stake in what happens with Iran, because they get, I think it's about 1.5 million barrels per day of oil from there. And I've heard some commentators speak recently saying that China has a strategic reserve that could enable them to lose that for even some number of months. But if it was a situation to where Israel had destroyed their ability to produce oil or get rid of it, or produce it rather, and export it, then that can have a real impact on China. So I can't see a scenario whereby China and Russia would allow Iran to fall, which is the objective of many, at least commentators in the United States and in Israel.
I completely agree with that. I don't think either one of them wants them to fall, and they will assist from a financial perspective, from a military perspective. I meant more from the boots on the ground perspective. On the boots of the ground perspective, China's kind of, for a very long time, has been very cognizant of not putting their boots on the ground, and that has helped them develop their economy in a significant manner, and develop their kind of engagement and trade agreements with a wide range of countries, even within Africa and various other regions like Southeast Asia. So when you've basically got that scenario, China clearly, I believe, won't physically get in there, but they will do, as you said, which is assist from a military perspective, from an economy perspective. And so I think that's where China comes in. And as you mentioned, Taiwan, I mean, again, this becomes the question. If America is forced into this war or engaged into this war for Israel or has boots on the ground, then it definitely will be a prime time for China if they want to take Taiwan. So again, that would be where I'd look for China to have actual boots on the ground, is in that specific situation, in that specific time would be the best time to go for Taiwan.
Yeah, and as I argue, and actually had a show a couple maybe yesterday on that very issue of Taiwan, we don't have the capacity nationally. The United States doesn't, to fight and sustain a war anywhere. Forget about multiple venues here, whether in the Middle East, Europe with the Russia-Ukraine situation, if we could get dragged into that, or God help us in the Indo-Pacific. We're already scraping the bottom of the barrel with what we're providing to to Israel, and to the Ukraine side, and to Taiwan, because we gave them the largest ever package we just did. And our coffers are starting to run a little bit dry. So if we get into a fight, we're going to be in real trouble. And on that point, I want to go and focus a wee bit more here on the military aspect about where this is going. And here's one of my biggest alarms that I raise, especially if you're pro-Israel, if you're pro-American, and you want those two countries to do well, it's time to put the brakes on this right now. Because let's look first of all at the Hamas situation in the Gaza Strip. They said that a year ago that their objective was to destroy Hamas to bring peace back to Israel so that the people can live in security in there. They're no closer to that today than they were before. And the reason is very fundamental and predictable. You cannot wipe out all of these people and not have the survivors turn against you in even stronger methods than happened before October 7th of last year. So you've created the conditions to make security much less in that one there. And I think we talked a little bit about the situation with Hezbollah, and that is a 5-10 times more difficult military task than the Hamas one was, and for many of the same reasons. And then now, if you think about starting one against Iran, I don't see any militarily attainable objective other than lobbing a bunch of missiles or airstrikes. But if you don't go in on the ground, the war can never end. So what is the end state for Israel?
I think you just hit the nail on the head, and you highlighted a very important point. And I know that wasn't the main part of your question, but I just want to highlight the point you made, which is that if you make the argument from the Israeli perspective that Hamas is this evil entity, and it is not an entity that is based on resistance, you have to admit that this entity does exist. And the mode by which this entity existed, those conditions were there in the past. And no one can deny that what's happening since October the 7th, those conditions are significantly worse than the prior conditions. And therefore, if those conditions created Hamas, what will these current conditions create?
Yeah.
And so if anything, what you've done is created an almost Hamas 2.0 for the future, or a Hamas 3.0 for the future, something which is a lot more basically has seen the entire family be destroyed, have seen the entire civilization being destroyed, the entire country being destroyed. So I think that's a very important point that you mentioned, and that's why they can never succeed in Gaza, because what is the psychology of the people fighting against Israel in reality is the psychology of resistance. They want resistance. They want to resist against the oppression, and they want sovereignty of their own country. So they can never succeed in that. Moving to South Lebanon. Now, with South Lebanon, the reason they can't succeed is actually different. It's because from a psychological perspective, they can succeed, and hence why they've been trying that propaganda. They've been trying to create a civil war amongst the Lebanese people. Oh, guess what? There are people in Lebanon who are against resistance, or there are people in Lebanon who are against Hezbollah, and to try and create this civil discontent where they can go in. So psychologically, they can actually win the war in Lebanon, which is different to Gaza. But from a military perspective, they can't, because Hezbollah is, as we mentioned, a very strong army, a battle-rendered army, an army that beat Israel in 2006 significantly, and so also fought ISIS. So it's an army that knows the terrain really well, knows the situation really well, and is battle-hardened. So when you put all of those things together, from a military perspective, I think the situation in Lebanon is going to be very difficult. How far do they need to go into Lebanon to ensure that they succeeded to control the area? How far do they need to go to basically dismantle Hezbollah? Again, something that's not going to be possible, in my view, from a military perspective. So if you look at the entire objectives, there is no end goal. And that's what makes this entire thing so hard to fathom, because we're here discussing what is the Israeli end goal, and yet we can't see it because there is no end goal. There is no situation where, based on the current actions of the Israelis, you actually have peace in the Middle East. Hypothetically, if let's say they somehow destroyed all of Hamas, which is not possible, but let's say hypothetically they had, and hypothetically let's say they'd removed all the brought all the hostages home, and they'd got rid of everyone on the West Bank, those Palestinians would still exist, and unless you wipe them out of civilization, and those Palestinians would still have the psychological imprint of what they've seen. And there will be people who'd want revenge. And so then there would never be peace in those lands. So in reality, from all angles and avenues you look at it, there's no way that their actions actually result in peace. It's actually more for causing more mayhem, more destruction. And the only people winning is the military industrial complex and Israel in terms of their expansionist ideology.
Man, that is such a good point. I actually hadn't thought of that point yet, but we're seeing a lot of that play out with, whether it's Armenia, Azerbaijan, things that have been going back for decades and decades and decades are still playing in the today. You have a lot of friction today between Poland and Ukraine because of some stuff that happened with some a lot of deaths back in the Second World War period. They haven't forgotten any of those things. Nobody that survives this is going to forget either, especially if they feel like they were literally ripped off of their land and exiled somewhere else. So even if Israel succeeded in physically, ethnically cleansing, like wiping them all off the map and getting them anywhere else on somebody else's map, all they're doing is building yet more trouble for themselves in the future. And we haven't even talked about the Iranian part of it yet, but everywhere you want to look, there are real problems unsolvable for the Israeli side that it's just not going to end well for them.
Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree.
Okay, so that was the military perspective. I want to, in the last amount of time we have here, I do want to look at the moral aspect of it, because in my view, in many ways, that is the most important thing, because when you're talking about humanity and culture and everything else, you've got to be able to live with your fellow man if anyone is ever going to have any kind of peace and security. And we talked about earlier in this episode about how, the attitude to dehumanize an entire population is enabling the violence to continue to go on. And I want to show an example of that. This is Ambassador Tsipi Hotelevi. I may be saying her name wrong, but she was talking about some of these accusations that the IDF has been assassinating children in the Gaza Strip with snipers. Watch this exchange on LBC.
How are these Palestinians supposed to defend themselves when not only are the settlers attacking them, but IDF soldiers are actually watching on and encouraging them and egging them on, and even snipering kids with precision shots into their heads?
Is that true? Those are very hard accusations that have no base as a matter of fact, because...
Save the Children have reported it. I've had Human Rights Watch, I've had Amnesty International. in their Crossing Thresholds report. There are multiple reports from multiple NGOs and Israeli soldiers admitting to it live on TV with Matt Fry, their colleague on Channel 4 News.
I'm sure you're taking your information from sources you believe are reliable, but all I can tell you is lying? No, I want to tell you what I know. What I know is that in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, the way we call it, there has been increase of terrorism in Jenin. Jenin has become a huge terror hub. We are in a point where those terror hubs are threatening our people. I completely agree that if someone is committing a crime, he should be taken to court and pay the price for it, but definitely not familiar with any facts about.
Oh, except that you had the New York Times publish a very detailed observation that 65 Western doctors, nurses, and paramedics actually saw a lot of that. 44 of them, in fact, saw multiple cases of children who had been shot in the head or chest. And some of the descriptions I've shown on a previous episode are just almost too disturbing even to watch again. But it's horrific. And then yet you see, the spokesman will go out there in public and just say, yeah, no, that's not happening. You probably believe them, but there is no point of fact. It's definitely not true. And yet you see with your own eyes it is. Now, here's the thing. You can blind the people in the United States and they'll take her version over anybody with brown skin any day. But the folks on the ground, they know the emphatic part of that true all day long. And that's just going to fuel their hatred back again for Israel.
100%. And like what you're seeing again is what we talked about earlier, which is what the psychological perspective that's applied to basically rationalize your reasoning for committing inhumane acts. So as an example, she talked about Jenin being a terror hub. So that's that is the language or the linguistic language that's going to be used for the reasoning of why they're going to start basically taking parts of the West Bank, start controlling, occupying a lot of it more. So we're already seeing what their blueprint is for the West Bank. But what you said is extremely important, that in reality, you've got but let me be clear on this. Even though that is the case, and even though you've got a scenario where the mainstream media essentially is playing defense for them, in reality, the best thing that ever happened was X and TikTok, where a lot of this propaganda, but mainly X, where a lot of this propaganda can be exposed. And so that's the reason why you see the vast majority of people are aware of these Israeli camps. There are videos of snipers taking out children. There are actual physical evidence of that. You saw the New York Times report with the bullet in the skull. So when you look at all of those things, Israel's losing the information war as well, especially when it comes to Gaza. Now, in terms of Lebanon, they started a lot more earlier with the information war. And even then, what's happened is because of what people have seen in Gaza and what they've learned in Gaza, that's why in terms of the invasion of Lebanon, when they make these claims, it doesn't work as well. And you saw it in terms of their actions. When they're bombing cities in Beirut, that just doesn't work. So a normal person sees that and they see just normal civilians being killed. No propaganda is going to work on that. And for example, one of the recent areas which was bombed in central Beirut, I mean, that wasn't even a Shia area. It was mainly a Sunni and Christian area. When people are seeing Christian churches being bombed as well, again, all of these things doesn't help with the propaganda campaign. Whereas in the past, they used to do these actions, they would kind of be hidden away by the media or the media would minimize it. But now they're being highlighted on social media. And so therefore, even from that perspective, they're losing really badly.
And I want to look at a separate aspect of this with one more clip here, because it's a different kind of problem. So what you're about to see is an Israeli spokeswoman who's going to talk about how Israel just wants peace, etc., and wants a ceasefire, but only under certain conditions. But I want you to pay attention, though, to the dismissive attitude and the condescending way she's going to present this that makes anyone who disagrees with her sound like they're stupid. Watch this.
Hezbollah and Iran are signaling yet again they want a ceasefire. Israel is receiving indirect requests from Hezbollah and Iran for a ceasefire, a source told the Jerusalem Post. We've spoken about similar reports in the past. Iran and its proxy army in Lebanon wants Israel to stop hammering away at them, but not because they want peace. Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic of Iran want a chance to rebuild, rearm, and again be ready to rocket Israel's people while invading its northern towns. That is why Israel is responding with a no, thank you. Israel doesn't want that kind of ceasefire. In fact, it needs a new reality where Hezbollah cannot fire.
So look, the only way that you get to that objective, that we don't want a ceasefire where you actually have a negotiated settlement, i.e. where you have to give and take something so that both sides get something to where they want. The only way that they get to her version is that they eliminate everyone. And by the way, up to 25% of the country of Lebanon has received evacuation orders from the IDF, meaning that they plan on going a long way up into the north. So the only way they attain their objective is if everyone is wiped out along the path here. And this dismissive attitude just really irked me, I got to say, even just watching this, because she's like, of course, everyone should just get out of the way for us. How is that meeting or toiling into your media narrative that you were just talking about?
Yeah, I mean, look, it just literally shows that you can basically say to the people that, look, we're willing to kill, we're willing to oppress, and then based on a specific angle, you make an excuse for it. Well, guess what? There's no leader of the past that you would consider an evil, oppressive person that did it just because they want to do it for fun. They always had their own reasoning for it, and they tried to make excuses for their actions. Do you think Hitler, when he went in, he was like, oh, guess what? The Jews, we just want to kill them because we're going to have fun? No, he was given his reasoning, or he was explaining what his reasoning was, and he was trying to convince his populace of why they wanted to do it. So whenever an evil act occurs, those in charge of those evil actions always try and make excuses for them. But what's important to note from what she said, and something you highlighted, is that in reality, we know that Hamas wanted a ceasefire immediately. On October the 8th to 10th, they actually said that we will return all of the hostages for a ceasefire. This was reported by the Times of Israel, and Israel rejected it. You saw her debating today, the Israeli spokeswoman, who said that they also were offered a ceasefire by Hezbollah and Iran, and they rejected it. Today, Naim Qassem, the current maybe leader of Hezbollah, saying that they want a ceasefire, but if there's no ceasefire, then of course they will defend themselves. So what that tells you is that there's clearly one side who wants a ceasefire and wants some form of settlement, some form of peace, and the other side doesn't. And the irony is that the side that doesn't want it is almost laughing, goading the other side to say that wanting a ceasefire is a sign of weakness. And so that shows the psychology of these people, but they're able to use those words and almost try and, with a bold face, try and convince the people that having a ceasefire is not a good thing. And that just shows what the temperament of the people is. And it's quite sociopathic, and it's actually significantly concerning for the future if their thought process is that they don't want to go to the table ever, they don't want a ceasefire, they don't want to return the hostages, and their aim is to continue into Lebanon, as you said, in a significant distance. Some even said all the way to Beirut. That's like 100 kilometers in. And so if they're going to go that far, and the aim is to dismantle Hezbollah, well, they weren't managed to dismantle Hamas. So in reality, it's just to cause as much mayhem as possible.
Now, given all of that, where can this go? Because you can also add Iran to that list, who said, hey, that last barrage we had, that's in retaliation for what you've already done to us. And as far as we're concerned, we're done. We don't want a wider war. You have, Gary just showed the headline as you were talking right there. Hezbollah also says, hey, we're ready to do a ceasefire. Obviously, Hamas is willing to do a ceasefire as well, as long as there's some kind of give and take and not just orders to surrender, etc. So everybody wants this war to end, and certainly Russia does, China does, the United States says we do, but yet we're the ones providing all the ammunition and the political and diplomatic cover necessary for this war to continue to go on. So the question is, where does this end? And is there actually, let me ask you a different question. Is there a risk in your estimate that all of these other components combined may one day come to the conclusion that even though fighting a war would be very costly for us, there's no other choice been left to us now, because we're either going to all be destroyed or we're all going to have to come together to fight against Israel? Is there a risk of that?
I mean, that's my view is that's what they should be doing now. in that regard. Like if you take on Israel in multiple fronts, Israel can't stop it. Now, what the concern is, or for example, let's take Iran's example, their concern is that America is then going to engage in a more significant, overt manner, boots on the ground, and they don't want to get into a war with America because, like, let's be clear on this. Any kind of war with America, as much as how bad it is for Americans, we know it's going to impact the economy. They won't be able to afford it. But even from Iran, an economy that is improving significantly, a civilization that's improving significantly, they want everything in their power not to be in war. If they get into any form of physical war with Israel or America, it is going to impact the economy. A good example is just look at the history. Whenever two countries have gone to war, it's significantly impacted both economies. You look at the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s. One was the second strongest economy in the Middle East. The other one was the fourth. After it, they were both destroyed. So both sides clearly don't want it. And so when both sides don't, Iran really doesn't want it. But in my view, Israel's objective is going to be that they're going to go after Iran. If they somehow succeed against Hezbollah, which I don't believe is going to happen, but if they were to, then their aim is to go after Iran. And so why not go after them now? This was my argument about Hezbollah when they went into Gaza. But the issue with Iran is they're probably thinking what we're thinking, that Israel is going to struggle against Hezbollah. And if they are struggle against Hezbollah, then obviously Iran's never going to they won't have a situation where they need to fight Iran. But yeah, I do believe that the best way to deal with this is to basically attack Israel on multiple fronts, by Hamas, by Hezbollah, by Iran. And then in that regard, then that does draw US in, but then there isn't that greater appetite in the US to have a war with Iran. And so therefore there will be a lot of issues with the US engaging, and it'll be difficult for them in terms of troop deployment and so on and so forth. And I think they should basically do that, because if you know that you're going to be the target later, why not take a situation now where you're forcing the enemy to fight on multiple fronts?
I suppose from Iran's perspective, it's also a legitimate consideration to say, hey, these guys are going to get bogged down in southern Lebanon, so let's don't engage with them so that we don't become the target of anybody else, and let them get bogged down there. And then potentially if they get weakened, then they can do something later. So there is a definite differences of opinion on that. I want to comment real briefly before we get off here on that headline that Gary just showed there, that the United States is saying that, we're really concerned about this apparent starvation effort going on in the northern part of Gaza, and that unless they start letting a lot of these humanitarian aid in there, we're going to hold up arms transfers, etc. Now, interesting that we put a date of 1 month from now instead of like immediately. And oh, by the way, that's after the U.S. election. And if anything happens in Iran, I'm guessing that no one's going to even remember about this. But at least they're saying that. Does that hold any water to you?
It doesn't hold any water because, as you said, the American election is in a few weeks. Now, I know the Biden-Harris administration will still be in charge in a month, but I think this is just statements that are being made. In reality, Israel is going to be the arbiter of whether there is going to be any form of humanitarian aid going into Gaza. We know that the previous time Biden even spoke about the possibility of having some form of embargo or having some kind of stopping of weapons going in, especially if they're not guided. He got significant pushback from the military industrial complex, from the media, and from people within his own administration in terms of within the Democrat Party and the Republican Party, the Uni Party. So him making that decision is not something that would be accepted anyway. So I don't see that happening. I think this is just more trying to appease the Democrat voter base, because obviously, as you know, a huge part of American voter base. I was on the ground in America. I spoke to many Democrat voters in a wide range of areas, and a lot of them were very adamant that they would not be voting in this election, that they would abstain their vote. And so if that's the case, then this is just one way of trying to appease them, but I don't think it's going to be enough.
Yeah, I don't either, but we'll have to see what happens here next. We'll see what happens in southern Lebanon, because I think that we're going to see over in the coming weeks that the casualties are going to start piling up for Israel, and that could change the dynamics a lot. Of course, we're waiting any day now, any hour now, potentially Israel could do something into Iran, and we could have a whole different conversation tomorrow. But we'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you so much for coming on. This has been very enlightening, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on. Much appreciated.
And we appreciate you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't already. We got some other great shows coming up for you tomorrow. We got Colonel Doug McGregor, one of our favorites, on at noon tomorrow, and Larry the Shirt Johnson, another famous favorite one, former CIA analyst, also going to be on tomorrow afternoon. Ambassador Chaz Freeman and our longtime favorite Matthew Ho will also be on Thursday. So a lot to coming up here. Also, remember that we're on podcast now, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, anywhere you get your podcast. Be sure and type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you will be sent right there. Thank you very much, and we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.